Hey everyone, this is chapter 14 of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School, by Philipp Lenhard. In May 1962, the Argentinian Pollocks came to Montagnola for 2 days. That was not a lot of time to get to know each other again after so many years, but Pollock enjoyed the visit. He was still not entirely at ease with his brother, but he got on extremely well with Ida, and especially with his niece, Lilo, who was now 49. Pollock had reluctantly agreed occasionally to represent his brother's business interest in Europe and the United States. As a result, he sometimes had dealings with Lilo's husband, Paul Zomer, who was an investor in Juan Pollock's enterprise. They just about got on, but Pollock disliked Zomer, who he felt treated Lilo badly and was often disrespectful towards Ida. He took great delight in his great-nephew Peter, however, who on his recommendation had come to Switzerland to study and with whom he was subsequently in regular contact. Unfortunately, Peter was not particularly happy in Switzerland. It was, quote, remarkable how Argentinian the German Jewish children are, end quote, Ida noted in a letter to Pollock. To cheer Peter up, she wanted to give him a copy of Martin Buber's book Begegnung, meetings, and for, quote, Christmaka, quote, as he asked Pollock to get hold of it for her. The kind of great uncle who felt responsible for his family and brought his nieces and nephews gifts. This was certainly a new role for Pollock, not least given that he himself had no children. Pollock had no regrets in this respect, but since his retirement had little contact with younger people and lived in what one might well describe as a self-governed old people's home on an idyllic Swiss resort. In one of their conversations, Horkheimer expressed his disgust at the fact that, rather than, quote, bawling about what is bad, end quote, he was now, quote, a Jew of independent means with a German passport living in Ticino, end quote. Pollock was more at ease with this situation, but it also changed him. Pollock clearly felt the impact of an advancing age. Pollock was sick more often and took longer to recover. Writing to congratulate Pollock's brother on the occasion of his 70th birthday, Fred or Fritz, whichever you prefer, end quote, wrote that Juan should not mind, quote, if old age takes its toll, it is, e.g., a widespread misconception that one needs less sleep in old age. This holds true only if one is entirely inactive. Otherwise, the opposite is the case. I, much to my regret, am finding out in my own case, end quote. When Otto Kirchheimer congratulated him on his own 70th birthday, Pollock responded that it seemed, quote, strange to me that I have now entered my 8th decade. Yet, who am I to argue with the birth certificate? I certainly intend to do something worthwhile in my remaining years. One of the areas to which he wanted to turn his attention was the sociology of old age, a field study then still in its infancy. In 1958, the German broadcaster Süddeutscher Rundfunk ran a series of programs on, quote, old people in our age, end quote, to which Pollock contributed a lecture on, quote, growing old as a sociological problem, end quote. Pollock pointed out that rising life expectancy would lead to the older age groups forming an increasing share of the overall population, while their, quote, social utility, end quote, and status, end quote, decreased. In 1900, merely 7% of the German population had been aged 60 or over. By 1950, that proportion had doubled, and it was anticipated that by 1957, roughly 20% of the German population would fall into this category. Pollock raised 3 principal concerns. Firstly, increasing automation would devalue the advanced skills of older, more experienced employees. Instead, quote, youthful, end quote, attributes such as, quote, speed, versatility, a rapid grasp of new tasks, end quote, would take center stage. Secondly, inflation had systematically wiped out the assets of the bourgeois middle classes in the years since the First World War. As a result, power and capital had come to be concentrated in, quote, ever larger capital conglomerates, end quote. This meant that, in addition to no longer being able to rely on their advanced skills to shore up their status, old people were no longer able to depend on inherited assets either. Thirdly, the family had been transformed from a unit essentially geared to production into a much smaller community of consumers. As a result, intergenerational relations had become much looser, and elder relatives were frequently encountered exclusively as a burden. Quote, this makes cohabitation, especially given the current housing situation, unbearable in ways that wholly undermine old people's esteem and status, end quote. This marginalization led to boredom, loneliness, and despondency, as well as material and intellectual misery. Those of advanced age soon became physically and intellectually old too. In this sense, old people now were, quote, older, end quote, than their counterparts had been a century earlier, people who were redundant, withered as individuals. In political terms, there were two possible approaches to the issue. One could follow either the social democratic principle of solidarity or the conservative principle of subsidiarity. The former expected society as a whole to take care of and integrate its older members. The latter assumed that smaller social units, families, or communitarian institutions were better placed to take on this task. Empirical studies demonstrated that neither the young nor the old still looked to the intergenerational family as a suitable means of maintaining intergenerational solidarity. Social policies designed to reinvigorate the extended family for this purpose were therefore anachronistic and doomed. This left only social policies predicated on solidarity of the kind that were increasingly becoming the norm. Yet these too faced problems as automation reduced the numbers of employees able to pay into the social security system, while the number of those in receipt of support rose. Quote, the liberating and solving potential, end quote, that attaches to old age, quote, just as much as the risk of isolation and growing lonesomeness, can only be realized if society creates a meaningful and secure status for the older generation. It can presumably be constructed only on the basis of objectively required social functions and a protracted period of purposeful preparation, end quote. Pollock had his doubts as to how robust and resilient the principle of solidarity would prove, and saw no prospect of a better organized social order that would genuinely improve the lives of older people. Far from it. The more younger Germans sought to shake off the legacy of National Socialism, or what they assumed that legacy to be, the more youthfulness would trump old age. For many in the post-war generation that has entered the history books as the, quote, generation of 68, end quote, and a generation of revolt, the previous generations embodied the harmful German tradition that led directly to Hitler. To sustain this vantage, they ignored everything that was youthful, dynamic, and subversive about National Socialism, and instead identified all forms of conservatism of any kind as attachment to tradition, and any kind of attachment to tradition, with, quote, fascism, end quote, thus eschewing all the hard questions a serious engagement of the Nazi past would have needed to address, which is, of course, precisely what made this approach so compelling. Given the obvious parallels between the increasing prioritization of younger employees and their specific traits and characteristics in the economic process, and the anti-authoritarian revolt of the young directed at the anti-authoritarian revolt of the young directed at the old and decrepit, Pollock instantly recognized that theirs was in fact a conformist rebellion. Marking Pollock's 75th birthday with a laudatory article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in 1969, Horkheimer stressed that his friend was, quote, the opposite of an apologist of violence, end quote, placing him radically at odds with the militant arm of the APO, the so-called extra-parliamentary opposition, quote, to hypostatize the revolution, end quote, Horkheimer wrote, quote, and affirm it as an absolute goal in countries where freedom currently has an abode, end quote, would be as alien to Pollock, quote, as a profession of faith in Hitler or Stalin, end quote. Members of the Institute certainly maintained relations with leading APO figures, but the extent of the student movement's identification with the Frankfurt School has generally been exaggerated. Among the activists were many who distanced themselves from the more academically focused second generation of critical theorists. That included scholars such as Jürgen Habermas, Herbert Schnedelbach, and Albrecht Wellmer. They were desperate to find a shortcut to practical political solutions and liked to think of themselves as the, quote, third generation, end quote. Pollock, Horkheimer, and Adorno viewed this primacy of praxis with great skepticism. Quote, once again, end quote, Adorno lamented in a text that he wrote just before, and that was published in Die Zeit 9 days after his death in 1969, quote, the antithesis between theory and praxis is being misused to denounce theory, end quote. Adorno pointed to the concrete example of a student whose, quote, room was trashed because he preferred to work rather than join in actions, end quote, and on whose, quote, wall was scrawled, quote, whoever occupies himself with theory without acting practically is a traitor to socialism, end quote. While Adorno had direct dealings with the revolting students and knew the leaders of the APO personally, Pollock and Horkheimer never really came to Frankfurt. Even so, Pollock obviously registered what the radical students were making of the critical theory he had helped develop. The reappropriation of Marx's critique of political economy, often accompanied by sympathies for the Soviet Union, would certainly have reminded Pollock of his own youthful enthusiasms, yet these were no longer the 1920s. In the meantime, the show trials, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, the Second World War, the civil wars in China, Korea, and Vietnam, not to mention the Shoah, had taken place. One could no longer draw out the Marxist tradition as though none of this had occurred. This kind of Marxism was not only ahistorical, it also ignored the failure of the labor movement when confronted with the greatest catastrophe in human history. Now in the late 1960s, one could only continue with the kind of orthodox reconstruction of Marxist thought to which Pollock himself had made a significant contribution with his doctoral thesis of 1923 by ignoring its historicity. Contemporary Marxism and obliviousness to history went hand in hand. This also explains why he repeatedly urged the removal of Marxist terminology from a prospective new edition of Dialectic of Enlightenment, for which there was enormous demand among the students. In 1961, he had still expressed his misgivings about republishing the book at all, suggesting that only select sections should be reissued. By the late 1960s, this position was no longer tenable since numerous pirated editions of the book were already in circulation. An authorized Italian edition with 29 revisions by Pollock came out in 1966, and in 1969, Dialectic of Enlightenment was finally reissued in an authorized German edition with minor revisions. How astute Pollock's assessment of the students' ahistorical reading of Marx is demonstrated not least by the case of the prominent SDS, Socialist German Student Federation, member Hans-Jürgen Kroll, born 1943, arguably one of the intellectually most gifted leaders of the student movement. Kroll was one of Adorno's doctoral students and concerned himself in great detail with the thinkers that also preoccupied his supervisor, Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, and above all Marx. Yet their assessment of political reality differed considerably. Detlef Clausen, who also studied with Adorno and Horkheimer and was one of Kroll's fellow activists, has lamented the inclination of the, quote, third generation, end quote, to, quote, level the experience of National Socialism into a dangerously flat concept of fascism, end quote, that it applied in a flippant and overly loose manner. While Clausen expressly exempted Kroll from this critique, a close reading of Kroll's version of critical theory illustrates the degree to which his experiential background, radically distinct from that of Pollock and his peers, shaped his vantage on the world. Having previously advanced a similar critique in an article published in the leftist daily, Frankfurter Zeitung, a week after Adorno's death, Kroll, in a radio debate about Adorno broadcast by Hessian Public Radio in December 1969, vehemently criticized the, quote, cognitive constraints, end quote, that according to critical theory followed from, quote, the experience of fascism, end quote. These constraints engender the erroneous assumption in the critical theorists, quote, that collective practice is necessarily destructive of consciousness, that through collective praxis class morphs into mass, end quote. The ignorance betrayed by Kroll's suggestion that the former emigres were in the grip of a, quote, regressive fear of expressions of practical resistance, end quote, was not only juvenile, but potentially anti-Semitic. Jews had more than ample grounds to associate revolution with anti-Jewish violence, after all. It was no coincidence that Krall and his peers perpetually spoke of fascism rather than National Socialism. If, quote, Auschwitz, end quote, did get looked in, then almost invariably as a metaphor for the generic horrors of late capitalist modernity. For many of the radical students, Pollock, Horkheimer, and Adorno were simply conservative and or defeatist, quote, elders, end quote. Reporting on a teach-in in Frankfurt with Rudi Dutschke, the best-known figurehead of the student movement, Hilke Schläger, then a Zeit editor. She was soon to emerge as one of West Berlin's most prominent feminist broadcasters, wrote, quote, their students have long since started to look at the, quote, elders, end quote, whom they consider, quote, lacking in resolution and too timid, end quote, with nothing but contempt, end quote. 3 weeks later, Kai Hermann suggested in The Sight that the student's current idol, Herbert Marcuse, given his lack of, quote, ideological asceticism and revolutionary optimism, end quote, would likely soon share the fate of Habermas, Horkheimer, and Adorno, who despite being, quote, the father figures of the young German left only yesterday, have since been retired, end quote. In addition to the generation gap, a number of political factors contributed to the alienation between the young leftists and their academic teachers. These included the former émigrés' identification with the United States. It tended to make them staunch supporters of West Germany's Western integration and led some of them to be ambivalent in their assessment of the Vietnam War. As the New Left turned on Israel following the 6 Days War, the student movement also found itself at odds with the solidarity of many Jewish academics with the Jewish state. Critical of Zionism as an ideology, Horkheimer nevertheless supported Israel in various ways. Although neither of them ever visited the state, Pollock too was well disposed towards Israel. Pollock refrained from publicly criticizing Jewish nationalism and certainly had no time for the students' anti-Zionism, not least given that he rejected the Leninist concept of imperialism underpinning it anyway. In the aftermath of the terror attacks carried out by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine on a school bus en route between Avivim and Devev, two northern Israeli agricultural communities close to the Lebanese border, on the 22nd of May 1970, in which 9 children and 3 adults were murdered, Pollock wrote to Martin J. that his only consolation was Ben-Gurion's assertion that in Israel one needed to believe in miracles to be a realist. Roughly at the same time, an SDS delegation traveled to Jordan where, on some accounts, they attended a Fatah training camp. The chasm that gaped between the founding fathers of critical theory and the young rebels could barely have been more profound. The year 1968 had not passed before parts of the student movement began to evolve into Marxist-Leninist cadre parties, initiating the transition from the anti-authoritarian to the, quote, proletarian, end quote, phase of the revolt. Pollock did not live to see what the plethora of new parties and so-called COG groups, or K groups, that were formed in the early 1970s got up to, but he certainly realized at the end of his life that the anti-authoritarian movement was going through a process of disintegration. Its descent into Maoism and Stalinism disappointed him, to be sure, but also vindicated yet again his decision to retire to Ticino. Meeting statutory requirements, Pollock's house in Montagnola was equipped with an air raid shelter just in case, but rarely in his life had he felt as safe as he did in his mountain refuge overlooking Lake Lugano. It says Lake Lugano, but I think that might be a typo. As a retired German professor, he drew a handsome pension and he could safely assume that his financial worries lay in the past. Of course, this retreat from the immediate cut and thrust of the public sphere also drew some flack. In 1962, in his introduction for the new edition of his Theorie des Romans, the theory of the novel, published by Luchterhand the following year, Lukács famously applied his own earlier comments about Schopenhauer, parenthesis, in the book The Destruction of Reason, end parenthesis, to Adorno and by extension to Pollock. Horkheimer and their other former émigré colleagues quote, a considerable part of the leading German intelligentsia, end quote, he wrote, quote, including Adorno, have taken up residence in the, quote, Grand Hotel Abyss, end quote. Quote, a considerable part of the leading German intelligentsia, end quote, Lukács wrote, quote, including Adorno, have taken up residence in the, quote, Grand Hotel Abyss, end quote, which I described in connection with my critique of Schopenhauer as, quote, a beautiful hotel equipped with every comfort on the edge of an abyss of nothingness, of absurdity, and the daily contemplation of the abyss between excellent meals or artistic entertainments can only heighten the enjoyment of the subtle comforts offered, end quote. End quote. Lukács' mockery soon found favor not only with the radical students but with mainstream commentators too. The journalist Johann Steinmeier, born in 1926 and a graduate of an extremely selective private school created and run directly by the Nazi Party in Feldafing, where, in 1942, a subsidiary camp belonging to the Dachau camp complex was established on the same property as the school, is a case in point. In an article with the title, quote, Die Revolution frisst ihre Väter, parenthesis, the revolution devours its fathers, end parenthesis, published in the weekly Der Stern in 1969, he derided the now retired founders of the Institute who had turned their backs on their students and, quote, moved away to fashionable Lugano, end quote. In May 1970, in light of the, quote, massive conflicts between Adorno and the student movement, and Horkheimer is dissociating himself from it, end quote, Klaus Grossner, parenthesis, who later rose to prominence as an investment banker and philanthropist, end parenthesis, writing in Die Zeit, proclaimed the, quote, end of the Frankfurt School, end quote. This is more than Pollock, now in his 76th year, was willing to countenance, and he sent a letter of protest to the editors of the site. He was particularly irked by Grossner's suggestion that Horkheimer had become a conservative in old age who, in the spirit of Paul IV's encyclical of 1968, Humanae Vitae, opposed oral contraception. Alas, Pollock's defense of Horkheimer did little to dispel the specific accusation. Alas, Pollock's defense of Horkheimer did little to dispel the specific accusation. The new means of contraception undoubtedly marked a significant form of progress, he conceded, yet it was important to take note of, quote, what needs to be sacrificed to this progress, end quote. Horkheimer, he explained, had wanted to point to a diminution of love that would result from this innovation, a diminution, quote, that it would be pointless to want to prevent, but of which one should at least be aware, end quote. In this respect, Pollock and Horkheimer's position indeed bore a striking resemblance to the encyclical's insistence on the inseparability of intercourse as a mark of love, parenthesis, significatio unitatis, and parenthesis, from intercourse for the purpose of procreation, parenthesis, significatio procreationis, and parenthesis. Not that Pollock and Horkheimer were on a crusade for the, quote, bourgeois patriarchal family, end quote, as an outraged article in Stuttgarter Zeitung claimed. Yet against the backdrop of the Nazis' criminal eugenics and euthanasia campaigns, they felt that the impact of new forms of contraception required careful consideration. Pollock's work on automation stressed the extent to which the production process was rendering ever more individuals economically redundant, given that machines and robots were able to do their jobs in a more reliable and cost-efficient manner. It seemed oddly fitting and concerning that human procreation was now being optimized in decisive ways too. In this sense, the new highly efficient form of contraception was an instrument of domination. It offered yet another means of suppressing any kind of spontaneity that might get in the way of automated production processes. Intercourse was robbed of its unpurposiveness. becoming instead a means used either to achieve pure pleasure or to procreate. In both instances, sex was instrumentalized and consequently dehumanized. This process could be stopped only by insisting on its unpurposiveness and unconditionality. The encyclical insisted that, quote, "this love is human and therefore both of the sense and of the spirit," end quote. It was therefore, quote, "a product not only of natural instinct and inclinations, bracket, affectum, end bracket, it also and primarily involves an act of free will. Through this act of free will, bracket, the spouses resolve, end bracket, that their love will not only persevere through daily joys and sorrows, but also increase. Therefore, it is especially important that they become one in heart and soul, and that they obtain together their human perfection. Next, this love is total, bracket, pleno, end bracket, that is a very special form of personal friendship, whereby the spouses generously share everything with each other, without undue reservations and without concern for their selfish convenience. One who truly loves his spouse not only loves her for what he receives from her, but also for her own sake." End quote. The relationship between Pollock and Horkheimer may not have been a marriage, nor was it sexual in nature, and yet the encyclical's remarks would well describe their covenant, if one leaves aside the commandments of procreation. Pollock, Horkheimer, and Adorno all consciously decided not to have children. Each had established a form of kinship with their closest friends and associates. Of course, this meant that their, quote, "families," end quote, would cease to exist when their friends died. For obvious reasons, Pollock had never been a great fan of the idea that sons and daughters should step into their parents' shoes. Even so, as Pollock grew older, he did wonder what his legacy would be after his death. In his eulogy for Franz Neumann, who died of injuries sustained in a car crash while on holiday in Switzerland in 1954, Pollock noted that believers might rely on a higher being to put a terrible blow such as Neumann's death right again. For non-believers, by contrast, life after death lasted only as long as one was remembered by one's loved ones. As long as one of their group was still alive, Pollock vowed, Neumann would not be forgotten. He picked up this theme again almost a decade later in the eulogy for his mother-in-law, Hella Bernecker, this time, rather remarkably, giving the idea a specifically Jewish twist. Quote, "The notion of hell and heaven was alien to traditional Jews," end quote, he explained. Quote, "The worst punishment we know of are not the torments of hell, it is banishment from the hearts of other human beings. Of all the curses flung at Spinoza, quote, 'you will not be remembered,' end quote, was the gravest," end quote. Yet who would remember the non-Jewish Jew and the godless materialist Friedrich Pollock? Since there would be no heirs in the conventional sense, once the other members of this, quote, "family," end quote, had died, he would have to find other ways of securing his legacy. One possibility was obviously the creation of a substantial body of scholarly work that might last. As the aforementioned corpus of notes and excerpts demonstrates, Pollock continued to work tirelessly on his labor theory in his final years. It was supposed to form the heart piece of a comprehensively renewed critique of political economy, a kind of cutting-edge post-Marxism. This was no mean aspiration, but would have made for a truly fitting legacy. Yet Pollock wanted not only his scholarship but his life too to be remembered. His intense preoccupation with issues of life writing indicates that he was preparing to put his house in order. It was no different from Horkheimer, who was, of course, a much more prominent figure. In his quest for a suitable biographer, Horkheimer gave a succession of interviews about his life. Pollock was frequently present and was able to provide valuable additional information, given how much of their lives they had shared. The first published biography of Horkheimer, a biographical essay based on numerous interesting documents and written by the journalists Helmut Gumnior and Rudolf Ringet, came out with Revolt in 1973, soon after Horkheimer's death. It is well worth a read. The following year, Horkheimer's former assistant, Alfred Schmidt, published an introduction to Horkheimer's philosophy. A second biography, written by Maimon Mayor, followed in 1981. Other important works of importance to my own work have been published since. What concerns us here is that both Horkheimer and Pollock were keen in their final years to ensure that appropriate accounts not only of their life's work, but also of their lives would be forthcoming. This has made my task easier in some respects. The detailed interviews with Ernst von Schenk that Wiggerhaus used extensively are case in point. Wiggershaus also used extensively are case in point. Given the dearth of documentation regarding the earlier periods of their life, not least given that they were forced to leave virtually everything behind when they fled Germany, these interviews are of crucial significance. Yet one also needs to bear in mind the extent to which they are shaped by various forms of self-stylization. When Pollock criticizes Horkheimer's conservative lifestyle, for example, he is not only teasing his friend, but the two of them are in fact putting on a performance. There's a clear dramaturgy to scenes such as the following. Pollock: I don't really understand why you still write in German cursive. Horkheimer: because the transition to Latin script was too practical and functional. To which I didn't want to conform. I would say that the fact I didn't go along with this marks the distinction between us. One could describe this distinction between us precisely in terms of my not going along with this. It is the same with my wearing suspenders and a waistcoat. It is just the same. There are innumerable such things. It's just the same with his not wearing suspenders as a matter of course, the occasional exception aside. Pollock: I never wear suspenders. Horkheimer: and when they were abolished, he abolished them too. Originally, he wore suspenders too, and originally he wrote in German cursive too, but then, when one switched over to the other script, he went along with it, and I refused to go along with either." End quote. Thus they set in scene a juxtaposition that contrasted Horkheimer, the insistent, slightly eccentric traditionalist who kept alive elements of a lost bourgeois civilization, to Pollock, who went with the flow, wore crepe soles and belts, and wrote in a way that readers born after 1945 would find more accessible. Similar juxtapositions also characterize the Spinner project. Pollock artfully crafted as a work of autobiography. Quote, "Fred's gravity is demonstrated positively by his loyalty to us," end quote, one of the aphorisms explains. Even though, quote, "taking air travel and shaving cream into account, he probably belongs to the other generation," end quote. Pollock not only dressed stylishly then, but also used shaving cream, abandoning the shaving brush, and preferred aeroplanes to boats. All this brings with it the risk of our only ever seeing Pollock through Horkheimer's eyes, when it may well be that Horkheimer's assessments of his friends sometimes tell us more about himself than they do about Pollock. Nor can there be any suggestion that Horkheimer's autobiographical novellas offer us an accurate account of the events they portray. Even so, they do offer us some insight into the youthful Horkheimer's feelings and thoughts and his sense of interaction with Pollock. With the papers they left at the time of their death, we are on more reliable ground. Yet there, too, we need to be careful. The Pollock who not only preserved, but also, as at least in part, ordered the thousands of items, letters, notes, manuscripts, typescripts, all manner of miscellanea, was the aging social critic keen to secure his legacy. Adorno's concept of the, quote, "message in a bottle," end quote, of which one would never know whom it might reach, also holds true for Pollock's papers. He archived them in the hope that somebody would one day find the message. At the end of his life, Pollock was unexpectedly able to help shape his legacy in at least one respect. When writing his biography of the Institute, The Dialectical Imagination, Martin J., then aged 25, not only visited the two friends in Montagnola, but also sent Pollock the draft prior to publication. Pollock both read it attentively and annotated it copiously. Not that J., who had a wealth of sources reflecting various vantages at his disposal, accepted all his suggestions, but Pollock's annotation throws an interesting light on the way in which he himself might have approached the task of writing a history of the Institute, and by implication his own. We may confidently assume that it would hardly have looked like this book, yet Pollock would hopefully show it the same forbearance he showed Jay's book, divergences of interpretation notwithstanding. On the 16th of December 1970, Friedrich Pollock died of stomach cancer in Montignola. Just months earlier, he had still hoped that he might recover sufficiently to continue working. Quote, "By the way," end quote, he wrote to Jay on the 22nd of August 1970, having annotated about a third of his draft, quote, a very thorough examination in a leading Swiss hospital informed me that my illness is painful but not dangerous and will in due time disappear. Pazienza, they say in Italy, end quote. I'm going to read the epilogue. That's the end of the chapter. I'm going to read the epilogue in addition to this chapter, just because the epilogue is very short. I'm typing these lines in the recently renovated cafe on the ground floor of the artist's house in Stuttgart. The exhibition spaces, studios, and workshops are located on the upper floors. In 2018, an exhibition by Christian Flamm engaged the history of this institution established in 1978. 2 floors were left entirely empty on the ground floor. Flamm placed dozens of white paper rolls resembling construction plans never carried out that have long since completely faded. On a table in the center of the room stood a model, approximately 50 centimeters in height, of the building's facade. Behind the facade, one saw only a vague representation of the foundation walls leading nowhere. The stark white walls and low ceiling of the elongated room lent it a strangely constricted and oppressive air, its brightness notwithstanding. So many people have gone in and out of here that the stone floor is smooth as glass. The upper floors looked much the same. Here Flamm had reconstructed the walls at the center of the room, 1.5 meters thick, that were originally installed in 1978 so exhibits could be attached to them. Of course, the history of this building, which is instantly recognizable as a former factory, began long before it became the artist's house. It was in these elongated halls that hard-working employees once produced suitcases bearing the Nord Pole logo, the logo of Nördlinger and Pollock. To this day, vintage enthusiasts may occasionally find leather cases with the logo, showing an ice bear standing on a suitcase in front of a stylized globe, on eBay. Yet the business and its erstwhile owners have disappeared. Like archaeological finds, the suitcases and ammunition pouches occasionally recovered from dusty attics seem to connect us to a past that is long since past. The factory once owned by the Pollocks is now a site of communication, art, and creativity. Nothing recalls how the building is connected to this book. The same holds true for other sites I visited to gain a sense of Pollock's surroundings. The house in Freiburg, where he was born, was demolished after the war. His grandparents' house in Vera has survived. Ironically, it is located across the street from the offices of ʻpɔlɔk in Freiburg, the current publisher of Pollock's collected works. ʻpɔlɔk is also generally associated with, publishes a lot of anti-Deutsche stuff, or things related to it. It is much the same in Stuttgart. The house of Rheinsbergstrasse has disappeared. The villa on Lessingstrasse still stands and is as impressive as ever, but its surroundings have changed radically. Pollock's residence in Munich has gone. The property where it once stood now forms part of the perimeter of the American consulate. It has, rather fittingly, become extraterritorial and part of the United States, as it were. The unimaginative neoclassical architecture on Odeon Square that Pollock and Horkheimer were able to see from their window, looking across the Hofgarten as they watched the Freikorps hunting revolutionary workers, by contrast survived the bombing raids of the Second World War. Thousands of tourists come each day to take photos of the Feldherrnhalle, Field Marshal's Hall, in many cases probably without knowing any more about it than that it's somehow connected to Hitler. The house in Kronberg and Horkheimer's villa in Montignola still stand. In Montignola, the new owners have even preserved part of the original interior. The original bookcases, parenthesis, though not the books, end parenthesis, are still in place as is the old typewriter in the study. The spacious patio overlooks the garden, in which Ernst von Schenk, Matthias Becker, and Martin J. once interviewed Horkheimer against the backdrop of the mountains and palms surrounding Lake Lugano. On the left, a tree of almost 30 meters overlooks the garden. At the level of the patio, it has formed two separate trunks. It sounds so corny that one hardly dares mention it, but the double-trunk tree standing directly on the boundary between the two properties seems emblematic of the covenant of friendship between Pollock and Horkheimer. Pollock's former villa has not survived. A wealthy Russian had it demolished and replaced it with an eyesore of a high-security compound. Two servile Moors stand guard at the gate, which bears the inscription ʻpʒlɛk. Like their previous residences in New York and Los Angeles, the properties in Montagnola were in prime location, and it has been a long time since two professors, no matter how established and well-placed, would have been able to acquire them. What remains? The traces of history inevitably fade, much like tombstones that are symbols of mourning, but also remind us of the past and allow us to recall those who have died. In this sense, we might consider this book a tombstone for Friedrich Fred Pollock, designed to ensure that not just the name and dates inscribed on the actual tombstone in the Jewish cemetery in Bern, located less than 100 meters from Maidan and Max Horkheimer's headstones, but his life, thoughts, fears, hopes, actions, weaknesses, and strengths too are remembered. There are two mistakes in the rendering of the traditional blessing. May his soul, quote, may his soul be bound up in the bond of eternal life, end quote, based on 1 Samuel 25:29 on Pollock's tombstone. The first letter should not be something in Hebrew, but another letter in Hebrew. The penultimate letter should be not either that letter in Hebrew, but another letter in Hebrew. Perhaps, perhaps the possibly Christian, and stonemason was responsible for the errors. Perhaps the two friends were trying to tell us something that we have yet to decipher. That's the end of Friedrich Pollock, the Éminence Grise of the Frankfurt School by Philipp Lenhard. Thank you so much for listening.